Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from Catherine Temple and Mike Collins in Washington, DC. The event today is being run as part of Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. One of the aims of these events is to enrich the series through art, philosophy, and poetry. Our speaker today is Claire Bloom Saunders, and she and I should have been in the US this week, but owing to a technical hitch, we've had to postpone the visit until September. However, Claire has agreed to give the talk that she would have given in person, but now has to do so over Zoom. But she will be back with us in September in Georgetown for a panel discussion on the future of the humanities. Your participation today is as important as ever, so please type in any questions you have by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can do this from the moment we begin the session. We will endeavour to answer your questions depending on the time available. I'll now hand over to Catherine Temple, who will introduce Claire Bloom Saunders.
Well, welcome everyone, and we're very excited to welcome Claire Bloom Saunders virtually to Georgetown today. She's a senior tutor at Blackfriars Hall and a lecturer in English at St. Catherine's College. Her research interests include 19th century women's poetry, 19th century uses of history, particularly medievalism, and 19th century women travel writers in Europe. These interests are reflected in her publications, including a number of books, for example, Women Writers and 19th Century Medievalism and Women, Travel Writing and Truth. Current projects include Medievalism, 1830 to 1918, Politics, Literature, and Society, a book on the political uses of Anglo-Saxonism and medievalism in the long 19th century, a study of the continuities and connections between the works of William Blake and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and work on Phoebe Anna Takwar's illustrated editions of Dante and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She continues her research focus on the work of Louisa Stuart Costello, 1799 to 1870, who was a poet, travel writer, translator, medievalist, historian, novelist, and visual artist. With that, I want to welcome Claire to our series, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Mike. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'd like to start with the letter from which the quotation in the title of my talk today comes. It is so good here to go out, watch all the unapproachable beauty in nature's details, then come in and use this and that particular bit, which has come like a fresh discovery. This is a letter from Phoebe Anna Traquair to her nephew. Phoebe Anna Traquair is the Edinburgh-based Irish nephew, and in the letter, Irish artist. And in this letter, she's explaining to her nephew how she uses the natural world in the Scottish landscape around her as an inspiration and stimulus for her work. Traquair was an artist who delighted in nature. She further wrote to her nephew that an artist should seek to match the beauty of red-lipped buds, sunlight through green leaves, the yellow gorse on the hill, the song of the wild bird. In this, she resembles William Blake, who was one of her greatest artistic influences. Blake, who famously urged in Auguries of Innocence to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. Like Blake, Traquair's engagement with nature was not a sentimental nor a simple one. Nature is inextricably linked with human experience, and both for Traquair as for Blake are engaged in a continual conversation, sometimes in harmony, sometimes a struggle. In her art, Traquair uses nature to provide meaning and to lead those engaging with her art to a greater understanding of themselves, their communities, and the world around them. And this is the focus of my talk today. First, a bit of background on Phoebe Anna Traquair for those of you not familiar with her work. Although the best thing I can actually do is to direct you to Elizabeth Cummings' extraordinary biography, which is the only full-length study of Traquair that we have in existence and was reissued last year. Traquair is born Phoebe Anna Moss in Dublin, and she's inspired by childhood visits to the medieval manuscripts housed at Trinity College Dublin, particularly the Book of Kells, to pursue a career in art. This led to an introduction to her future husband, the Scottish paleontologist Dr. Ramsay Heatley Traquair, who was seeking an illustrator for his research papers. The two married, moved to Edinburgh in 1874, and Traquair illustrated her husband's papers for the next 30 years. She'd also had 3 children. However, despite this focus on scientific work, Traquair's main artistic inspiration came from literature. Fascinated by the interaction between the poetic and the visual imagination, she forged a career as an illustrator and as an illuminator, but moved to work on murals, tapestries, embroidery, altar crosses, chalices, altarpieces, pianos and furniture, enamel jewellery, as well as book illustration. Traquair became one of the first women honorary members of the Royal Scottish Academy in 1920 and continued working in her long career until her death in 1936 at the age of 84. But her art was grounded in this early experience of medieval manuscripts in Trinity College in Dublin. Early in her career, in 1887, Traquair wrote to John Ruskin for advice on medieval illumination, and this sparked months of correspondence, during which Ruskin loaned her several 13th century manuscripts from his own library for studying and copying, and Traquair returned his originals with copies, along with original works as of her own. As an artist who worked as an illustrator for her husband on his zoological and paleontological papers, Traquair embraced Ruskin's focus on seeing, concentrating on the details of nature and using this to lead to an appreciation and understanding of the wider world around. You'll remember in Ruskin's preface to his Elements of Drawing, he writes, "I would rather teach drawing that my pupils may learn to love nature than teach the looking at nature that they may learn to draw." And in his first letter of Elements, Ruskin observes that the aim of his teaching is to help students to set down clearly and usefully records of such things as cannot be described in words. This comment, which Traquair echoes in her desire to reproduce all the unapproachable beauties of nature's details, the quotation in the title of this talk. So Traquair shares Ruskin's ideas about the importance of a focus on nature for artistic expression. One significant piece that Traquair sends to Ruskin is her illuminated book, The Dream. It's now in the National Art Library in the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's a tiny book, it's about 6 by 5 inches. And Ruskin's delighted with it. Here's the letter that you see on the side here, which he sends when he returns the book eventually to Traquair, saying, "At last I return the beautiful leaves I could not resolve to part with." Traquair binds this letter into the binding of the book, along with another letter from Ruskin's housekeeper, Joan Severn, from the 31st of July, in which Ruskin asked to borrow the book again. It's an extraordinary work, as Ruskin recognised. Here are some of the pages. It's a short, medievalised dream vision, obviously steeped in her appreciation of Blake. We've got these red-winged angels, many of them, as you'll see here, manacled. The speaker of the dream makes a sunrise visit to the abbey at Dryborough, based on Traquair's own experience of the abbey at Dryborough. And she describes it as grotesque, which obviously links to Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic. The speaker enters a gate directed by a man, you see in the slide here, and finds a garden of roses through which a white-clad figure walks, plucking flowers to create nosegays, which he throws into the outstretched, disembodied hands, which begin to appear relentlessly in the mist until the hands become too numerous. There's a forest of outstretched hands grasping towards the speaker, the flower gatherer. The vision becomes nightmarish at this stage. All the flowers of drop from withered and colourless from the fingers of these disembodied hands, and leaving on the palm of each a dark red spot. On turning back to the flower gatherer, the speaker sees him now struggling through thorns and a hissing wind, snatching not flowers, but thorns, weeds, or whatever came, with torn and bleeding hands. As it draws near to the speaker, their eyes meet in a great wind which bows the speaker to the earth. When the speaker arises, the light of the evening is glowing through the delicate Gothic mullions of the western window, barring the golden sky, and a flock of pigeons rise from the interior of the rings and set off towards the setting sun with the sound of innumerable wings. There's a clear Christian message to the work. It's definitely a precursor for the work to come, with what appears to be a spiritual journey through life to the afterlife. But there's a very clear use of the natural world as symbolic here, in the way that many of the medieval romances use symbols from nature. We can see this again if we turn to Traquair's letters. She returns to many of the images in the dream in a letter to her nephew from April 1896. She writes, "Only some live in a garden where flowers forever bloom, when they listen to music not heard of men and are bathed in sunshine which never burns. These come out of this garden from time to time, their hands full of gifts gathered in the sunshine. Others, and one must not blame them, have arid patches of ground and would starve utterly did they not sometimes gather from this rich fellowship. The worst of it is, so often they don't gather, but drag, tear, crush, and find thorns. What you have to do is to be rich, rich in yourself. You gather direct from the fountainhead of all beauty, and when you have gathered in from the dawning sky, from the springing grass, from the primroses, just pour it out again to others." She's responding here to her nephew. She thinks he's lonely. She says earlier in the letter she thinks he's lonely in the city where he's now living. And so this letter perhaps offers us an alternative way of reading the dream. It's about using natural resources responsibly for nurturing others and one's own life and spirit. And again here, Traquair's engagement with Ruskin's thought is clear. For example, if we look at this, one of the lectures, the second lecture from Ruskin's The Eagle's Nest of Wisdom and Folly in Science from 1872. In this lecture, Ruskin says, "In a little while, the discoveries of which we are now so proud will be familiar to all. The marvel of the future will not be that we should have discerned them, but that our predecessors were blind to them. But the misuse we made of our discoveries will be remembered against us in eternal history. Our ingenuity in the vindication or the denial of species will be disregarded in the face of the fact that we destroyed in civilized Europe every rare bird and secluded flower. Our chemistry of agriculture will be taunted with the memories of irremediable famine." Yes, believe me, in spite of our political liberality and poetical philanthropy, we shall be remembered in history as the most cruel and therefore the most unwise generation of men that ever yet troubled the earth. The most cruel in proportion to their sensibility, the most unwise in proportion to their science. No people understanding pain ever inflicted so much. No people understanding facts ever acted on them so little. The dream then is significant both as an artifact and as an example of the environmental artistic vision that Traquair shares with Ruskin, and as a precursor for her varied and prolific work to come, a rare example of the ways in which Traquair herself connects image and text in her own original work. The illustrator's duty to text is something of which Traquair was extremely conscious. In one of her most significant early books, offered illustrations of scenes from Dante's poetry, is published in November 1890. Writing again to her nephew Willie in February of the following year, Traquair articulates her approach to illustration. "You see, I adapted the diagrammatic manner on purpose. It being necessary in a set of consecutive drawings meant to guide the reader and not to confuse him, by pictures suggested by Dante, which is quite a different matter and of which we get plenty. But I think to simply follow Dante and let the poet suggest his own pictures is best. As Chakray explains in an interview with Margaret Armour for The Studio in a special issue of Winter 1897, she turned to illustration herself because of a great desire to project feelings or emotions and a consciousness that direct transcript from nature did not relieve me of the burden of feeling, which was the moment was master. Chakray strove to communicate meaning through the interaction of image and text. The poets whose work Chakray chose to illustrate all deal with human life and experience and engage with nature in their work. A trip to Italy in spring 1889 was transformative for Chakray, as experience of Italy was for many other women writers and artists of the period. Travelling in a party led by the Free Church theologian Dr. Alexander White and his wife Jane, Chakray was able to discuss writers like Dante at length, prompting the publication of her illustrated Dante in November 1890. Experiencing the work of early Tuscan painters, Giotto, Frangelico, Botticelli, firsthand for the first time, had a profound and lasting effect on her later work. After her first illustrated Dante in 1890, she produced a further illuminated edition of Dante, his La Vita Nuova, in 1899. In the next 10 years, from 1890, Chakray produced numerous illustrated volumes, several sonnets from D.G. Rossetti's The House of Life, which delighted his sister Christina. She writes about it in a letter. He illustrates Tennyson's In Memoriam, Robert Browning's Saul, William Morris's Defence of Guinevere, and the Song of Solomon in the same year. Chakray works on illustrations for Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese for 5 years, from 1892 to 1897. And these brought her fame in London as a leading illustrator when they were exhibited there in 1898. Chakray's illustrations for Sonnets from the Portuguese explore the nuances and groundbreaking poetics of EBB's negotiations with the medieval Petrarchan sonnet form, with which both had engaged in their reading of Dante. The influence of Blake's illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy is seen vividly in Chakray's innovative illustrations for the Sonnets from the Portuguese. In the Sonnets from the Portuguese, EBB self-consciously transforms the conventions of the traditional sonnet sequence that Dante's Vita Nuova exemplifies, presenting a female active speaker rather than the passive female beloved, and an interdependent and equally active male beloved. EBB continues to engage with Dante throughout her work, and touches of Dante can be seen in all her major work, including Casa Guidi Windows and Aurora Leigh. Chakray's illustrations illuminate EBB's innovations and highlight their shared medieval sources, doing so through Blakean images which demonstrate her own medievalist influences. As Chakray realizes, there are many obvious connections between EBB and Blake. They were influenced by similar dissenting contexts, not least in the ways in which EBB draws on Blake's social critique in works like The Cry of the Children. Both are interested in Swedenborg, both are skillful and politically engaged medievalists who, like Chakray, share a deep engagement with Chaucer and with Dante. Chakray's illustrations reflect these literary and aesthetics conversations and, crucially, demand a recovery of EBB's visionary poetics. Despite the fact that there is clear evidence from her notebooks that sonnets from the Portuguese were the results of years of experimentation with the sonnet form, which predate her first meeting with Robert Browning, by the 1890s, what Marjorie Stone has called the appendage approach to Elizabeth Barrett Browning was at its height. At this stage, EBB had been dead about nearly 30 years, and her husband had become come to the fore as a famous poet. In the 1890s, we find EBB judged more as a muse to her poet husband than as a poet in her own right. So, for example, in 1882, Hall Caine refers to the sonnets as essentially women's love poetry, essentially feminine in their hyper-refinement, while Hugh Walker considers them the genuine utterances of a woman's heart. So despite the fact that we have evidence of decades of work on the sonnet form, they're dismissed as being biographical, as about her own love for her husband. But one key figure who did realise the power of EBB's work was Oscar Wilde, who wrote in 1880 that she is the greatest English poetess, showing, and I quote, a creative energy that is born of the spirit, a winged rapture that is born of the soul, a force and fervour of mere utterance that is all the wonder of the prophet. Traquair similarly appreciates the extraordinary innovation of EBB's sonnet sequence and highlights it in her Blakean Illuminations. Sadly, I haven't got time to take you through all 44 of the sonnets here, but here is an example, sonnet 14, which gives us this very clear example of the visionary dream illustration, which is inspired by Blake's Albion Rose. The speaker, arising from and surrounded by the elemental flames of love, stands upright, arms outstretched, an image of the lovers erupting from the top of the head. However, instead of the clear full frontal masculinity of Blake's figure, in Traquair's illustration, the focus is an androgynous giant, born of earth, fire, and sea, who creates a new image of love, the haloed lovers emerging from the mind and imagination of the haloed creator. But like Blake, Traquair here is seeking the sublime elemental forces of nature as a means to demonstrate the innovative powers of EBB's work. Just one further example of Traquair's use of nature in the sonnets. On the surface, we have here an illustration which is quite a typical medieval illustration. We've even got in that illuminated letter I a dragon which looks straight out of the Book of Kells. This sonnet is a particularly revolutionary one in terms of EBB's poetics. As Shaka Agajanian has noted, this sonnet is in many ways a revolutionary from using a poetic natural image, the image of the palm tree, as a way of expressing love. So she calls the lover here, "Oh, my palm tree," which is impressive given that in centuries of the genre, with all possible combinations of parallels of the natural world, we've not seen this idea of a palm tree used before. And in this sonnet, EBB, the speaker, asks to have the reality of her lover here with her. So she's completely overturning this idea of dreaming about a distant lover, a lover who's not there. She wants the lover to be with her in person and at realities of love, and she wants to get rid of all the boughs that are strangling, all the vines that are strangling the palm tree in order to get to the realities of love. It's an innovative sonnet in the sense that the octave of the sonnet glides into the sestet. As you can see on the page here, this sort of block presentation shows that. So this, we have quite a revolutionary sonnet, and what Traquair does here is let EBB's sonnet speak for itself. We're back to this idea of letting the poet guide the illustrator. So she has what appear to be quite stylized medieval depiction of nature, and these vines that are literally exploding from the page, coming out of the page, and with the lover and the beloved finding each other in that vineyard that's sort of strangling around the sonnet. So we have a different example of how Traquair uses nature differently, natural imagery differently to present the sonnet. The idea that EBB's sonnet poetics are innovative and visionary has been the focus of critical attention since the 1980s. But what's remarkable about Traquair's Illuminations is that she identified and illustrated these qualities at a stage when the appendage approach of criticism of EBB was at its height. That a woman illustrator working at this time could not only see what Wilde calls the creative energy and winged rapture of EBB's work, but links it with the romantic visionary medievalism of Blake and presents it as a transformative, transhistorical, ongoing conversation from the Book of Kells to the medieval text and art of Chaucer and Dante, Michelangelo and Botticelli. is well worth further critical interest and investigation. Margaret Armour's 1897 article for the studio, which is in response to the fame that these sonnets bring Traquair, places Traquair as one of two leading artists in the revival of illumination, and allows Traquair the space to explain her artistic approach and the differences she sees between decorative art and fine art. All decorative art, of which illumination is but a department, being in its very nature an accompaniment, as an instrument is to the voice, and in this absolutely different from a picture, which stands alone on its own merits, the desired end being a whole in which the sympathy between parts is perfect. If I meet with a book which stirs me, I am seized with the desire to help out the emotion with gold, blue, and crimson, or is it a wall to make it sing? And here, Traquair is clearly referring to the two of the decorative arts for which he's most famous, book illustration and mural paintings. Traquair's first project of painting a wall to make it sing, as she calls it here, was completed during 1885 and 1886. She was commissioned to decorate the mortuary chapel in the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh. And in the words of the Scottish art historian and critic James L. Cole, Mrs. Traquair, choosing motherhood and the life beyond as subjects, transfigured the walls with beautiful pictures which spoke of love and hope and reunion. Traquair started her second mural sequence work on this extraordinary cycle for the Song School of St Mary's Episcopalian Cathedral in Edinburgh in autumn 1888. Taking as her theme the canticle Benedicite Omnia Opera, all you works of the Lord, praise the Lord. The focus is on images of celebration and of creation. If you remember in the canticle, it goes through all the different aspects of the world that should praise the Lord. You angels of the Lord, you heavens of the Lord, sun and moon, stars of heaven, etc. Praise the Lord. It's a celebration of creation. When Traquair returned to the Song School mural after her Italian trip in 1889, she was energized by her experience of medieval art. Traquair's creative ambition saw every single section of the walls covered in exquisite detail and vibrant colour. In the murals, Traquair traces a spiritual journey, a celebration of life and human experience in all its myriad forms. So this is the room looking west, and here we are looking east. These photographs don't do anything like justice to the experience of being in the room. When I was first there, it was a very wet, very damp, very dark February day in Edinburgh. And still the room is alight and shining. It's an extraordinary sensory experience. And you don't really get the impression from these, but it's certainly worth a visit. So in the sequence, figures from contemporary art, music and literature. So we have here Tennyson, Browning, Carlyle, Dante Gabriel Rossetti are mingled with those long dead and portraits of actual churchmen and choristers from the cathedral. The whole is suffused with a riot of Renaissance decoration inspired by Botticelli. As you see here, the figure of Summer on the south wall and the flower-strewn meadow in which she and the procession walk are clearly influenced by the Primavera. Here's Summer a little bit more close up. The image of Summer with her armful of roses is also reminiscent of the flower gatherer in Traquair's own work, The Dream. Through her exposure to Dante's work on the Italian trip, Traquair had found even more inspiration from Blake and Blake's illustration of Dante's work. Traquair set scriptural scenes in the Scottish borders. Her leitmotif of the Liederfoot Viaduct standing in for the here and now. As you'll see here in the background, this is an image of the Three Marys, clearly influenced by Fra Angelico. In the background, we have this very recognisable viaduct from the Scottish borders. As ever, there's more to Traquair's nature painting than just a pre-Raphaelite delight in nature. We've got this influence of Fra Angelico. She later writes that Fra Angelico's art really belongs to the lyric but it is so purely spiritual, I can't compare him unless it be to spring flowers or boys' voices or birds. So she's seen a celebration of nature in Fra Angelico's art, which she's replicating here. But we have this extraordinary conversation going here between the scriptural image, which is copying, reminiscent of Fra Angelico, the setting of Scottish borders, the Renaissance design around, and in the foreground we have these very very detailed images of flowers, botanical scenes from cottage gardens. It's the flowers she'd have seen around her in the Scottish borders where she lived. So we have this combination of bringing all these different elements together for a contemporary audience. She's inspired by Blake and by Dante throughout the Song School murals, and here she puts them together on the north wall. There's a close-up of that in a way that actually they probably would both hate, but they're there for posterity together. In 1892, the year the Song School was finished, Walter Pater writes in his introduction to Purgatorio, he refers to Dante as having a minute sense of the external world and its beauties, a minute sense of the phenomena of the mind, of what is beautiful and of interest there, a demand for wide and cheering outlooks on religion, for a largeness of spirit in its application to life. Traquair shares this vision, and she finds influence in Pater and engages with Pater's thoughts on Renaissance artists throughout her career, as we'll see a little later in the talk. In 1891, Traquair starts work on the west wall of the Song School, either side of the Henry Willis organ, and she turns directly to Blake for her source here, quite clearly in the two pairs of red-winged seraphs, which seem to reflect the seraphs in the Book of Job, in the image when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And Traquair's image, these represent souls who have reached heaven, a union of human and divine. In this explosion of gold and red and orange, here's Traquair's own self-portrait of herself tucked away beside the north door, the exhausted and drained artist who had breathed so much life into the walls around her. Traquair would continue to develop and explore these accomplishments with murals for the Catholic Apostolic Church in Edinburgh, which is now the Mansfield Traquair Centre, a centre of her work in Edinburgh. And there's also a second mortuary chapel in which they transfer the original murals from the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and puts them in a new chapel, and she adds new borders there. In the early 20th century, Traquair completed a mural project of thanksgiving for Lady Darcy Godolphin Osborne, whose son had returned safely from the Boer War, decorating the chancel of St. Peter's Church in Clayworth in Nottinghamshire in the summers of 1904 and 1905, depicting biblical scenes that, like her Edinburgh murals, incorporated local people alongside scriptural figures. Here in the foreground of this image of the angelic choir, we've got the little boy who's been held in place by his older cousin. This little boy actually grows up to be the Bishop of Grantham. It's Anthony Otter, who becomes the Bishop of Grantham in Lincolnshire, and he reflects as in old age his experience of this, of being held in place. And Traquair delights in this naughtiness of his child and puts it there for posterity. And his sister is the trumpeter in the background, who's looking directly at the artist. So again, we see Traquair taking the people from the community around her and the countryside of the community around her and pushing it into these visions of celebration. In her final mural scene in 1920 for the Italianate Manners Chapel near Thorney Hill on the edge of the New Forest, it's built in memory of the recently deceased Lady Manners, Traquair took as her theme Te Deum Laudamus, a song of faith and praise, and here's the apse of that chapel. As she wrote to her sister Emilia, she included portraits of a range of figures who she considered all sing the Te Deum, though they don't often know it. The Te Deum meaning to her every beautiful and every fine thing. So we have here scriptural images of the Madonna, John the Baptist, of the Apostles, alongside men of science like Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur, flanked again by key literary and artistic influences, Tennyson and Blake. And for the decoration of this Manners Chapel, Traquair sets their figures in the new forest landscape that surrounds the chapel. One of the areas which Traquair is most famous is actually for her embroideries and her textiles. And her most ambitious and successful embroidered textiles, The Progress of the Soul, present the allegorical journey of the soul, which is prefigured in the early English manuscript The Dream that had so engaged Ruskin in 1887. To represent the soul in human form, Traquair turned to the central figure of another text from 1887, Denis L'Auxerrois, the second of Walter Pater's 4 tales published as imaginary portraits. So again, she's engaging with Pater's work. In Pater's story, Denis is a monk who is killed by his own people. Traquair takes this as a starting point for an allegory of the cyclical nature of culture and human behaviour, and as a means of exploring her strong Christian belief in the afterlife. In the 4 life-size panels that make up the artwork, nature is used to articulate meaning. In the first panel, the entrance, birds sing, grapes thrive on vines, a rabbit plays on the riverbank by Denis' feet. In the second, the stress, a snake curls around Denis' ankles, hands grasp the now startled birds, the rabbit hangs dead in the mouth of its prey. In the third panel, the despair, Denis hangs exhausted from the branches of the vine, which is now overrun with thorns. The snake has imprisoned his legs in its coils. In the final panel, the victory, which you see here, Denis is woken to eternal life with a kiss, pulled from the jaws of hell, literally a beast here with its teeth around Denis' ankles, as you can see. As always, Traquair's inspiration came from an imaginative fusion of a range of texts and art. Alongside Pater, the influence of John Donne is evident in the work's title. John Henry Newman's The Dream of Gerontius is traced in this final image, the Victory, where the rainbows and the red-winged angel reflect Traquair's consistent engagement with Blake. Traquair considered The Progress of the Soul embroideries her great hymn to all life, and they were among her favourite pieces. She bequeathed them to the National Gallery of Scotland on her death in 1936, so that anyone could visit and share the joy and consolation of her vision, and you can still see them there today. Traquair's near contemporary and countryman William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, visited Edinburgh in 1906 and recognised the ways in which encounters with her art reflects experience of Blake. He wrote to Lady Gregory, "Nearly all my time in Edinburgh, I was absorbed in Mrs. Traquair's work and found it far more beautiful than I had foreseen." He went on, "I have come from her work, overwhelmed, astonished, as I used to come long ago from Blake, and from him alone. She differs from all other modern devout painters but him in this supreme thing. The nearer she approaches the divine, the more passionate become the lines, the more expressive the faces, the more vehement in every movement. To the others, the world is full, and the spirit empty." In her art, Traquair wanted to show a society in which she saw loneliness, struggle, and isolation, a vision of joy and hope, where a focus on the world around could elevate the everyday to the divine. Think back to that letter of 1896, the contrast of those enjoying the garden and those in the arid patches of ground. Her public art commissions reconnect society with the beauties of the environment and with each other, as well as leading them ultimately to a communion with God. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction to an artist I had never encountered before. And I just have become very interested in that relationship between art and words on the page. So was a wonderful experience for me. I have questions, right? And I think one of my questions is really about her relationship to nature
Right.
and how you see that perhaps evolving over time, but it seems so mediated, by Blake, by Dante, by the medieval influences that you see in the works that you showed. And her expressions about it, the idea of using nature,
Mhm.
also seems somewhat alienating. So could you talk a little bit about that?
I think, I mean, when you read her letters, you see somebody who loves the natural world, and sort of sees like Blake sees the divine in the world around her, in the people around her. And so we see her using it in lots of different ways. One way is when she engages directly with nature, and directly transcribes nature and directly copies nature around her. And the other ways is to sort of bring this conversation with other artists, with other poets who have done the similar things in the past, and to move it forward and to move the discussion forward in what she sees as a way of giving her contemporaries, contemporary society, a way of celebrating itself. She looks around and she sees loneliness, and obviously she lives through one war and into the conditions that go into a Second World War. And she wants to provide hope, and she does that through nature in a variety of ways, either in quite naturalistic ways, in those detailed scientific botanical drawings that reflect her work for her husband, but also in the sort of symbolic medieval designs, as you saw in the Progress of the Soul. And she sort of plays with these all the way through her very long career. So we say using them in lots of different ways. But one of the things that she does, like Ruskin, is use nature to express ideas that can't be expressed in words. She finds using painting from nature a way of expressing that the beauties around her, the beauties of the divine around her, and so she's doing lots of different things. She's sort of experimenting with how to portray nature all the way through her work.
Okay. And yeah, so again, I mean, I guess, well, I'm interested in some of these, the last 15 or 20 years in environmental studies and eco-criticism, and that issue of using nature, or of taking from nature and separating ourselves as human from nature, right? And it almost seems like looking for the divine in nature is another version of that.
Yeah.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's sort of what she does is actually brings that back to nature. So she's not sort of separating herself from nature in that way. She's looking, she's not changing the nature around her and the environment around her. She's just seeing hope and potential and joy, and sort of putting that back. So rather than taking from nature, she's just illustrating, illuminating what's already there. So it's not a sort of a transactional relationship in which she's sort of taking away. She's sort of lifting it up, really, rather in this sort of celebration of it, rather than sort of plunging it in some way.
It's interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, I mean, could you make an argument that bringing nature into these highly mediated creations is a way of almost merging the human and the natural?
Absolutely, and that's what she's doing when she's putting these sort of stylized paintings in her murals in these very recognizable settings. She's doing exactly that for the people who are in the church, the people in those communities. They can see themselves as part of this extraordinary natural vision, a way of celebrating it. So yeah, absolutely, it's a way of merging that and actually bringing nature into those spaces that would otherwise obviously medieval churches would have had a painting on the walls, but that had been lost to time for the most part. So she's putting them back, and certainly in the song school, putting them around. I mean, the song schools, they're just it's where the boys and now girls of the Episcopalian Cathedral, Salisbury, where they practice. That's all. It's a practice room. And so what she's giving them around them is this extraordinary vision of nature, and celebrating them, recognizably for the first ones in that space. So bringing nature inside those otherwise stone walls.
It's on. I noted this idea of the sympathy between the two is perfect, and I think that was a reference to the writing and the art, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like the sort of meta message there is that the sympathy between nature and the human, you know, is something that's very important in the work. I see Mike has joined us, and perhaps he would like to ask a question. And we also have one in the Q&A. And I encourage anyone who wants to ask a question to just put it in the Q&A.
I just take this, thank you. It's a lovely talk, Claire, beautiful talk. And I wasn't aware of her work at all, you know, but, and it's within a kind of pre-Raphaelite kind of tradition, but I wondered, she's living at the same time as Hopkins. There's no references to Hopkins' view of nature and God.
No, not really. I mean, she doesn't really engage with Hopkins. The nearest we get is Newman in the Progress of the Soul, but no, she doesn't really. She comes from her background. She has a very her faith is quite Blakean, I suppose. I mean, her background is her mother was a Quaker sort of low Presbyterian church background, but she herself, her own personal faith seems to be more Blakean in that she sees God around her. She sees God in the people, you know, in human beings. She doesn't really. She writes very interestingly of being in church and doing those murals in churches when the congregation's there, and thinks about, you know, are they actually, what are they there for? What are they actually doing? So she certainly would be a very different religious outlook from Hopkins.
Absolutely,
But we haven't got any evidence of her. She engages lots of writers in her letters and lots of artists, but not Hopkins, as far as I can find.
No. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned, because of it saying that she's from Quaker. You know, same as the Welsh novelist Marion Eames. It's a different kind of approach to nature in humanity, really, and then to God, rather than God in nature.
Yeah.
So it just seems to go. It seems to go the other way, but it's very, very beautiful, very beautiful.
Yeah. The images are really amazing. I wish I could see them, you know, in person.
But next in Edinburgh, you must you'll see them.
We have a question from Adrian Vagene. Is it that she sees the transcendent within and given in the immanent, such that she isn't imposing the divine upon nature, but sees its basis in a transcendent ground?
Exactly that. I mean, what she's seeing is she's not sort of, as I was trying to articulate in response to your question, Catherine, she's not taking anything from nature. She's just trying to elevate what's already there. So she's just trying to sort of highlight what she sees as the wonders around her. I mean, there's one part where she talks about just the sound of. It's also quite synesthetic. The experience of her art is actually quite synesthetic. So she's thinking about sensory understanding of the world around you. So she thinks about the sound of eagles, of pigeons' wings. She said, you know, she writes this letter, or she's lying, she's seeing primroses and sort of very simple things around her on this hillside in one morning in the Scottish borders, and she thinks about the sound of the wings, the sensation of wings as they go above her head as she's laying on this hill, and so it is that just sense of recognizing what's there already, and not sort of taking from it, but just recognizing it and holding it up so other people can see it too. and putting it on walls. Or I mean, she's very interested in public engagement, which I think is why one of the reasons she's less well known than other pre-Raphaelite artists, I think, is because of she doesn't do many oil paintings. She doesn't do many traditional things that would hang in galleries, because she's very engaged with public art. One of the things she wants to do is to put these on walls where anyone can see them. So, for example, her work in the mortuary chapels, she's very aware that people who have lost their children in this chapel will be looking at blank walls. So she wants to give them something to look at when they're the lowest ebb of their life. So she's very interested in thinking how the viewer will respond to her work, but it's all this sort of engagement with other people. I mean, that's the sort of the heart of what she's doing. So so she's not as well known as other pre-Raphaelites because she doesn't exhibit in big galleries, apart from the Progress of the Cell, which we now have, and her self-portrait in Scotland. But I think that's why she's sort of underrated in a way, because she's more interested in everyday life. So lots of that, like she works on, she does these extraordinary panels for pianos and for cupboards. She's sort of like William Morris, really thinking about taking art into everyday life. But I mean, in the same way as William Morris his poetry, his extraordinary literary works are seen more generally in the culture secondary to wallpaper. I think it's the same thing, because she mainly does all that sort of decorative art. She's not valued as greatly as some other pre-Raphaelite artists.
That's so interesting. Once you get out, or once an academic or a writer, poet becomes popular, and gets out there and is really engaging with the public, seems to be the tendency, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We have a comment and a question. So John Fordresher, a very beloved colleague of ours at Georgetown, points out that Hopkins wasn't published until after World War I. Ruskin is key both his writings and his drawings, and his understanding that nature is the infinitely rich utterance of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And she would have known Hopkins because he wasn't published, exactly. So she wouldn't really have had engagement with him anyway. Sorry, what was that Ruskin quotation again?
The last part, I think an observation. His drawings and his understanding that nature is the infinitely rich utterance of God.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, her religious background, in many ways, she's not very similar to Ruskin at all. But that sense of looking in detail at nature and in appreciating it, and the value it can have for communities, for communities broken apart by industry or by war or poverty or whatever it is. I mean, her background in Ireland is very interesting in that her father was a physician, and so he was very instrumental in working with in some areas of Dublin with cholera, with the cholera outbreaks. And actually, her mother gets cholera, and her father nurses her mother better. But she has been sort of given this background from her parents of service to communities and service to the people around her. And actually, her father dies when she's only 8 years old because he works so hard in these kind of environments. And I think that's something she shares with Ruskin, this idea of duty to community and duty to society. I think that's something she certainly does share with Ruskin, as well as this way of viewing nature and the way in which nature can help alleviate human experience and show the possibility in humanity as well.
So we have another comment, which uses the word lovely and is also quite lovely in itself, from Patricia Marshall. As I see it, in using the local flowers and local people, she is raising up the ordinary, the everyday, the lowly, to a new spiritual level, which I find rather lovely.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. And putting those sort of naughty little choir boys, I love that one of the boy who becomes the bishop is having his head sort of trapped by his cousin. Putting those alongside Dante and Blake and the apostles, and just really elevating so that everyone feels important, and it's on the walls of, people are sitting in the congregation or sitting in the choir school and looking around them and seeing themselves valued and celebrated for posterity. Yeah, it is lovely. It's a very very engaging, very enriching experience, I think, her art.
Well, there's really so much to talk about here. I'd be really interested in hearing about her father as a science oriented towards the sciences, and whether that had an influence on the way she was representing nature. But we have one informational question, again from Adrian Vargenis. Does she have any interaction with the Scottish fairy tale author, Presbyterian minister George MacDonald?
Not that I've found so far. I can't quite remember what MacDonald's dates are, but not I found so far. But it would be worth looking at, because obviously MacDonald has medievalist interests and influences as well, and she certainly is very engaged in the sort of that Fantasecla kind of scene in Edinburgh. So I will look out for it and find out, but not that I've seen so far.
Okay, so thank you for all of this. I think I should turn it back over to Mike for him to make some final announcements, but it's really been just such a lovely experience, and I loved seeing the art and hearing your observations about it. So great appreciation from this quarter and from all of us.
Thank you, Claire, very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And did you want to ask any questions, Mike, or are you okay? No?
No, I thought the quotation from Ruskin, which of course wasn't what the lecture was about, was interesting. About no people had more knowledge and ignored it more thoroughly than this generation. It seems to me that applies even more to our own generation. We have even more knowledge about what global warming will do to us, and we do nothing about it, or very little, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very appreciative.
It just struck me as you read it. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely prophetic, isn't it? Sadly.
Well, Claire, thanks for a beautiful talk. Actually, raises our spirits, and on a dull day in March. So thanks very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, our next event in the Bent but Beautiful World series is after Easter. It's on Tuesday, the 25th of April, when Sheila Kapar will be giving a talk entitled "A People's Atlas of Nuclear Colorado." I can't wait for that one. Looking forward to that. On Wednesday, the 22nd of March, there is a Zoom which you might like to note. It's in the Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues, and that is to do with democracy in Israel, Israel entangled democracy. And notice, please, if you're in the UK, that will be an hour earlier in the UK than usual, 3 p.m. Instead of 4 p.m. because at that time, March 22nd, we still won't have put our clocks forward, but the US did that last week or so. All events after March the 26th will be back to normal in the UK. For today, I'd like to thank those at Georgetown University who have made all these events happen, especially our administrators, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. Thanks to Georgetown, to Jack DeGioia and to Tom Banchoff, Campion Hall, to Nick Austin, to Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrator at Blackfriars, to Richard Flynn, to John O'Connor, to Kinga Rona Gabnai. Thanks again to Maggie Scott as well. Don't forget to join us at our next free speech session on Wednesday, the 22nd of March at 11 a.m. EST and 3 p.m. in the UK, and the next Bent but Beautiful World event on Tuesday, April the 25th at 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. in the UK. And for those of you in the States, I hope we'll be able to rearrange the visit of Claire. I think Mike and Catherine will be joining us to talk about the Future of the Humanities project, tentatively put at 26th of September at Georgetown University. In the meantime, everybody, Keep safe, take care. Thanks again, Claire. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof.